Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Hi, I'd like to welcome you to the Encounter program. I'm Reverend Rachel Helgeson, and this is Reverend Kerri Allen. I'm really excited to be able to introduce you to her. Kerri and I have had known each other since seminary, but it's been more than that. Kerri has a lot of experience. She lives in the Chicago region, and I want to say that kind of broadly since she lives around and about and works in and around and about the Chicago region. In light of recent events, I wanted to invite Kerri to be able to speak to what is going on in the world, both from race and faith, but also about what's happening as far as medical and healthcare, particularly for people of color. And this is Kerri's specialty. So I'm so grateful, Kerri, that you could be with us here in the Binghamton region and to be able to chat with us a bit about your expertise and what you've experienced and seen, and to be able to help us maybe get an outside perspective. Sometimes that's helpful just to be able to see how God is calling us through other voices. So thank you so much for being part of today's program. So Kerri, can you tell me a little bit about what your role is in your region, just so I can give folks a little bit of a taste to know a little bit more about you and your work?
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks for having me too, and for opening up this really important conversation. So I work in healthcare as a healthcare executive in the spiritual care realm. So I work in a large healthcare system, and I have a number of hospitals throughout the state of Wisconsin. I live in Chicago area and have hospitals from southern to northern Wisconsin that I support. Their spiritual care departments and providing spiritual care support for across all of our kind of system. And so, you know, as you mentioned, I do I do have some academic expertise in issues around race, healthcare. Most of what I do really is look at the way that implicit bias plays into health disparities, and finding that learning about implicit bias, understanding how implicit bias forms how we interact. Saying humans interact, you know, with other humans as a whole, and really what that's about is about how we're formed in our sort of cultural ethos. And so that has an impact on, you know, what we saw over the weekend in Buffalo. That has an impact in what we see in the disparities in healthcare around COVID, other kinds of healthcare. That has an impact on when we see people that have been killed by the police. All those things are formed around how we are formed in community and culture and society, the historical formation, and then what the legacy of that is. You know, for Black people, for me explicitly as a Black woman, that context, you can't look at what the circumstances are for Black women today without really understanding that the historical context includes enslavement. That really was kind of how Black women in the United States, how we were seen, and then those things that have continued to be the continuation of that. So it doesn't look like the exact same thing as it did hundreds of years ago, but that there is definitely like a residue that then has material implications in the 21st century.
Right. So I'm sure you've probably heard this before, but when people bring up history and then they say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me, right? What would your response to that be? Like, because I don't hear you saying that. I think I hear a different tenor in that. No, actually, history has a strong part in who we are. I'm answering your question. I shouldn't be doing that, but I'm
right
about that for you.
So I'd say a couple things. So speaking as a Christian person, I would say, and for those people who also identify as Christian, I think you have to think about it from a theological perspective, in an understanding of like the past shapes who we are. And so when we think about what happened in the past, we don't, whether or not we're directly involved in that past, we still benefit from those things. And so then we have this kind of continued responsibility as part of a communal body. And so that's also to say that so as there continues to be impact from history. So if you look at the way that sort of Black women were viewed, during enslavement, particularly how Black women's bodies were mostly viewed as reproductive bodies. So the idea that Black women were supposed to kind of labor on behalf of the enterprise of slavery. So that meant that meant being raped, being forced to have babies that then were taken away from them, and then into the enterprise of slavery. So there's a lot to that, because there's scientific evidence that shows that we actually have like physiological and DNA trauma that's passed down from generation to generation. So there's that aspect of it. Completely outside of that really was the formation of how, I'm going to continue to use Black women as an example, just one example. There continues to be this idea of how Black women were viewed. So we may not be viewed exactly in that way, but there's still things about the way that we're viewed, whether it's like a hypersexualization of Black women. There's a sense of Black women being kind of invisible. So I use that example as that's something that I do, that a lot of my passion's around, but that also is consistent with other kind of stereotypes and tropes, and they happen in different, Black people are a really good example. But it happens in a lot of other communities of color as well. We see that with other, especially women of color, different ways that women are either hypersexualized or made invisible, and or how Black people are stereotyped. Now, all of that is really about dehumanization, right? Which is how you get to a place where someone can go and massacre people, can walk into a store, can see a white person and have their gun drawn on them and say, oh, sorry, and then go on to murder more Black people, because there's a sense of looking at Black people and not seeing human beings. There's a sense in an environment of a high anti-Asian sentiment, of not seeing Asians as human beings, of not seeing women as human beings, and on and on and on. And that's really what's at the core. So, and that's also what the relationship is to the history.
Yeah, that's it. Wow, Kerri. I was just thinking about how, from a Christian perspective, we talk about being created in the image of God. And and the Abrahamic traditions all speak about that, being created in the image of God, and to be able to dehumanize humans. Well, it does change what you see in front of you. It seems so obvious and yet so horrifying.
Right.
Because, and I appreciate what you're saying about the past affecting the present, affecting the future, which is something, again, speaking from a Christian perspective, we talk about how the story affects past, present, and future. One affects the other to affects the other. The story doesn't end because the book ends. The story continues. It's a beginning to the next part of the story. So I think it's something that we need to pay attention to. How are we humanizing people or dehumanizing people? What stories are we telling each other? I'm sure that you see that pretty closely in the healthcare system. How are we humanizing and dehumanizing people, especially within the last couple of years? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So, you talked about made in the image of God, and I was thinking about the creation text, talking about how God blew God's breath into us. And so, so that our breath of life is actually that of God. That's what the text implies. And so I think about this number of 1 million people who died from COVID. And that's I think about it in that context. So we're talking about 1 million other human beings that carried the breath of God in their bodies and now have no breath anymore. And so it's the thing about this, it's sort of an unfathomable number. And I think that the way that we have dehumanized in that context is that we're so ready to move on from the pandemic that we don't necessarily, one, that we totally act like there's no pandemic anymore, which is not true. And then that there are, there's a disproportionate number of Black and Latinx and Indigenous people, the highest numbers of folks who have died. The number of people who continue to die are those who really are most vulnerable. So have sort of really vulnerable kind of health conditions, including vaccinated people. Even though, we were talking earlier, the number of vaccinated individuals out of that million is 50,000. So definitely demonstrates that vaccines prevent serious illness and death. However, in that 50,000, you still have people that are really the most vulnerable. And so what I hear sometimes is the sense of sort of individualism and I have a right to not do this and that. And it's sort of a lack of care for like our siblings around us, that, it may be that to someone else, it's not just you who can get sick, it's other people that can get sick. And so, as I work with a team of chaplains and who we can be gathered in some spaces, not mass. And so I've said, I really want you to have consensus, and I want you to be sensitive to the fact that, you don't know everybody's story, and that their story could be that they have serious illness that would put them at risk if they do get COVID of dying. And that's the thing that I think we kind of are disconnected from. So it's not even to talk about like what mitigation efforts we need to have, but it's to talk about where are our values, what are the things that we believe about what each of us are entitled to as those beings that carry God's breath in us.
So if you're just joining us, I'm with Reverend Kerri Allen, and we have been all over the spectrum, particularly with concerning people of color, but not just that, talking about the humanization and dehumanization of people, particularly from things that recently happened within our region in Buffalo, and a young man thinking that it was his right to go and find a place to go and shoot. I can't even say it. Shoot people that were people of color, and dehumanize them to think that that was okay. And also to speak about what's happening in the healthcare system, and particularly how this has totally shown some of the holes in our healthcare systems, and how people have been humanized, who is cared for and who sort of is cared for and who isn't cared for. And then there sort of has been a rank and file in that as well, but particularly seeing who those people are and not necessarily knowing what their stories are. So Kerri's background, particularly her passion, is talking about the history and how it affects today for people of color, but her life work is also working in the healthcare system and overseeing chaplains in the Chicago region. So as if you heard earlier, she's all the way from Evanston out to, I want to say, Wisconsin, or
Yeah, in Wisconsin, yeah.
Wisconsin. So this is a pretty big area, and Kerri sees people in very, very urban areas, some more suburban areas like our region, and to very rural areas, which we know are right around the corner from us too. So Kerri has a big swath to be able to see where people are and how they're reacting to each other and what that looks like from a societal level. So Kerri, one of the things that while you were talking, I was hearing you say, and I'm wondering, a lot of us have become disconnected, not intentionally. I think there has been a craving to be community, but I think there has been sort of this unintentional forgetting of the people outside of our, at one point we were calling them bubbles, right?
Right.
Family unit, or a chosen family unit, or a friend unit, or a work unit, whatever is, but we had these bubbles, and if you weren't in that bubble, then you were out of the bubble, and you were basically didn't exist unless somebody like poked it. So I'm just sort of wondering if you've seen some of that, but also how are people coming back into that? I mean, because there is a deep craving for community,
right?
For in whatever ways that folks can get that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it is a really tough time to be a human being right now. And I think that it's undeniable that the limitation of kind of human connection that the pandemic has brought about is definitely part of that. And we talk about that through the Christian story as like being made to be in community together, that's part of our narrative. And so I think that, we know that on some theological level. And I think that there are opportunities to kind of connect with people. I think it's hard to be on Zoom is really hard. And at the same time, that saved lives, like our ability to do that. So I think the opportunity to reframe some of those things can be helpful. I also see that we can find ways of kind of gathering in community. I think it's important for us to name that disconnect as part of it. And then, that we can find these ways of being together. But in that, what I would argue for is that in that context, that we are also conscious about the ways that we can like mitigate the chances of spreading COVID, especially when somebody is involved that might be seriously ill. So if you know that a person is at risk, not that it's like like they can protect themselves, but I have a responsibility to them as well. And I think that that's the important distinction. It's not to say that we shouldn't gather. It's not to say that we should definitely do this or we should do that. But it's to think about it from that perspective. Like, what is it that I want to see in this communal kind of sensibility, a gathering together, and be sensible about that. But in terms of like that deep craving for and that sense of community, I think even doing this gives you an opportunity to connect, and that we have to kind of take advantage of those things. And then I think, and it's hard for me to speak to this because I have been very fortunate in this sense to be an introvert, because I know from some extroverted friends that it's hit them much harder than it has me. And so I don't get that sense, but that's also, that's also like getting to know yourself and then knowing what you need and then exploring possibilities for how can you get those needs met. Is there a virtual way of getting those needs met? Can you meet with somebody outdoors, still masked, like if you are, at risk of serious illness, and that that they value you enough as a human being that they're willing to do the same.
That's some very good points. I was thinking too, while you were talking about that, it's true. It has hit introverts, I think, differently than it has for extroverts, but also recognizing where our needs are and seeing how those needs can be met. I that really resonates with me, because as a pastor, I have seen how some of my folks are like, yeah, I'm good. I could stay on my couch and you can call me and I'm fine. And some other folks are like, no, I am crawling up a wall right now and I need some interaction, whatever that might be. And it's been interesting to watch that and to see how that plays out. But also, one of the things that I hadn't really thought about was how the mutuality piece about it, and while you were talking, it made me think of it's in one of the epistles where it talks about, should I eat meat? Should I not eat meat? And what am I doing here? And it's like, well, if it's gonna cause issues for another person, then that's going to be a problem, right? Maybe it's not an issue for you, but if that's going to cause an issue for somebody else, then maybe you need to think about that. That comes right from God's voice, right? And it's not an issue for the person being spoken to, but it is an issue for somebody else. And so in that case,
Right.
What are you going to do about that? And so, particularly thinking from a Christian perspective, but I'm sure that other texts have similar things, maybe not the same, but what is a mutuality that we're trying to meet? It's not necessarily about us, but if it's going to be a problem for your friend, your neighbor, then there's a bigger story there. And so it is about you, but it's also not about you.
Right.
It's about the we.
Right.
So we have just a few more minutes, Kerri. I'm just, do you have any further thoughts about the things that are going on in this world that you'd like to share with my listening audience here and with our WVNG folks, just to share with them a nugget of wisdom that to just sort of chew on and think about, and to know what is it that you would hope for them to think about and to consider?
So yeah, a couple things. I think that the thing I think would be is just kind of what you said about the we and the mutuality, and the idea of our sense of community, and understanding that there's a lot more beyond just us as individuals. And we don't necessarily come together as a bunch of like individuals, but we do, in that we have kind of our own, we're uniquely made in the image of God, but that then we also have that shared humanity together that connects us to one another. And so the importance of us thinking about everything, just beyond just ourselves, and in in a more communal sense. I just invite, especially those of us that consider ourselves Christians, to do that on an ongoing basis, and for that to be part of how we think about things as a whole. And I wanted to, of course, I'm getting older. I also wanted to make sure that we didn't end this without actually naming the victims of the Buffalo shooting. So is that okay for me to do that now? Read? Okay.
Speaking of humanization, let's please do
that. To recognize that these are, real human beings. A lot of times we say we talk about who they are in relationship to others. And I think it's important for us to remember that whether or not they have relationships, that they are human. So Celestine Cheney, Roberta Drury, Andre Macnell, Marcus Morrison, Hayward Patterson, Aaron Salter, Geraldine Talley, Ruth Whitfield, and Pearl Young.
Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayers. Friends, if you're just joining us, or you had a moment just to listen, I've had the honor to be able to speak with Reverend Kerri Allen, and to be able to be reminded of who we are as humans, but also to think beyond ourselves and to see the people around us. And the names that you just heard are the victims of the Buffalo shooting, and to just be reminded that they are human too. And as you heard Kerri speak earlier, that we each have the breath of God within us, right? My son is sitting on my lap right now, if for those of you that are on radio, and he is enacting the breath of God, I think. But but also say that when someone is not able to see that, to be able to understand that we dehumanize each other. And that's where we need to start, is to be able to see that we each carry the breath of God, and that this isn't just a one-time story, but this is an ongoing story that we need to do on our very everyday, daily basis. So thank you so much for joining me, Kerri. Thank you to our WPNG and Encounter program folks, and I hope that you will carry this with you in the time to come. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.